not all of them, but some of these entities and intelligences being actually from a different realm and like different level of reality, and like actually there's somebody there, is not just your imagination, is because of their computational capabilities. They're capable of doing things that I just find really, really surprising. For these entities to communicate with you, they need to kind of latch on to pre-existing information in your mind. Your mind is using elements of things that it has seen before to craft a kind of like suit or craft a kind of like interface that then functions as a way for that other consciousness to resonate and interface with you. Absolutely, consciousness is holographic. Solid scientific reasons to believe this. Intrinsically, these holograms, like everything reflects everything else. Like it's an integrated, holistic picture, and it's kind of this distributed knowledge. Consciousness clearly has that feature. High dose concentration meditation shows very clearly this feature of everything reflects everything else. You may enter this space called an indrasnet state, where you may see, let's say, like hundreds of eyes, and each of the eyes has a tiny reflection of all of the other eyes at once. I do like Bernardo Kastrup's speculations that like maybe UFOs indeed are actually kind of like conscious beings. We tend to think the flying saucer is the machine and the little entity inside is the actual alien, but it actually might be flipped over. Like the craft itself might actually be the consciousness.
Are mathematics, mystical experiences, and science more broadly all pointing to the same hidden reality, a kind of living geometry that dreams itself into an almost infinite multiplicity of ever-shifting forms? I don't know. I suspect that could be the case, though, and I riff on this and so many other wonder ticklers with the brilliant, unique, and just truly wonder-dipped Andres Gomez Emilsson of the Qualia Research Institute. He, and I would say QRI more broadly, spend a lot of time at the crossroads of physics, phenomenology, mathematics, and the mystery of consciousness in general, from the topologies of altered states and the strange entities that occupy those spaces, to the possibility that reality itself is conscious. I'm going to say this one goes deep. We do a proper lap around the wonder pool. And speaking of which, let's dip into it. All of the links that you will need for Andres and QRI are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And speaking of this media vessel, of course, it relies on your altruistic clicks. So do like, subscribe, comment, share. You know the deal. And if you'd like to not only support more directly, but initiate yourself further, check out our ever girthing members-only section on YouTube. And you can get all of that content and more, including Zoom Wonder Dips with myself and the community over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would truly love to riff with you there. And speaking of riffs, let us commence. Well, I'll be honest up front and say we had a fatal technical error where basically we lost the entire conversation. I have your entire side of the conversation and mine was lost. So super, super frustrating. So I want to thank you up front for doing this again so quickly. And I really do think that now that I've had time to just let your the collective qualia that is you steep in mine for a little bit longer, I think it's just going to be that much better.
Fantastic. So glad to be here. And yeah, no, I mean, those things happen, and it's, as you said, it's gonna be funny, like maybe for like a private or I don't know, the people who want to go to the backstage, you know, into to kind of like the artist's room, and you can provide the video, at least my part, to where like I'm just kind of like talking to the air.
I'll just do yours, and then people can pretend that they're
you could use AI to do your part, right? Like pretend that you're reconstructing. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, the possibilities are getting fairly serious in that regard. I mean, adjacent to this, I know where we started last time was consciousness broadly, you know, the nature of consciousness, where you stand on the question of consciousness. And I feel like we did sort of brush up against that topic of artificial, in air quotes, consciousness versus natural consciousness. And maybe that's something we can explore more this time. But let's just start with consciousness again, because it's such a ground floor question on everything I think that we're going to riff on. You know, as you know from our previous conversation, I'm really inspired by thinkers like Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, Federico Fagin, this sort of new wave of idealist philosophers, um, as well as Platonism and that whole milieu. And but I'm going to shut up now because I've been talking way too much. Where do you stand on that question of consciousness, what it is, and who philosophically is doing the most novel work that you think is directionally correct there?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for the question. And I mean, I am also inspired by, yeah, like that new wave of kind of analytical idealism. People
Mm-hmm.
who consider consciousness to be fundamental, but still are trying to find a coherent world picture that ties in together what we know from science and physics and biology, but not neglecting phenomenology. And yeah, Donald Hoffman and Federico Fagin. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Fagin.
Fagin is what I hear. Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Yes. And Bernardo Kastrup. Yeah. They're all an inspiring bunch. And generally, I actually tend to strongly resonate with a lot of like their points and arguments. Of those, actually, especially like Federico Fagin, like his book Irreducible, and a bunch of
yes,
lectures he's given are, I would say, like, yeah, very much in line with kind of like how we were thinking at QRI. QRI is a bit what we might call a full stack memeplex, in that it's not just a theory of consciousness. We also try to have like answers, about things pertaining to philosophy of math and like
mm-hmm.
ethics and like, the meaning of life and things like that. It's much more comprehensive. But yeah, definitely like our bit having to do with kind of like reconciling modern science and phenomenology is quite aligned with idealistic analytic idealism. To your question, like, what is consciousness? I remember last time I came up with this metaphor that I actually, yeah, I'm going to repeat, which is this idea that in science and in learning, various domains of knowledge, it is actually fairly common to kind of like start confused, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
think like this is so confusing and hard to make sense of, and then as you learn kind of like some of the initial models, and you start to be able to make some predictions, your confusion lessens, and maybe towards the end of high school, let's say if you're studying physics, like, okay, like finally towards the end of high school, you really grapple with kind of like classical mechanics, and like you start to really understand how Newton's laws like work and so on. And you get this sense of like, okay, maybe I've made it, like I kind of get how everything works.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
then you go to, undergraduate and grad school is like, and hold on a second, it was all of those were simplifications for something that is way stranger. And then actually you will probably spend the rest of your life actually being very puzzled and recognizing this is weird. So
Yeah,
there is this tendency of like, it's weird, and then it becomes more comprehensible, and then it becomes weird again, and often it becomes much weirder than
for
how it
sure.
started. In physics, just to ground this metaphor, for example, like metamaterials, to me are
Yeah.
mind-blowing. That, yeah, before you learn the basics, like things such as like the difference between a metal and a rock, is just incomprehensible. It's like, how could these different properties arise? And then maybe you learn about delocalized electrons and things like that. Is like, okay, I kind of get it. But then, yeah, if you go deep into like material science, you will encounter then again things that just make no sense from those that point of view. One I find fascinating is this concept of high entropy alloys, for
Mm-hmm.
example,
Mm-hmm.
which are mixtures of metals that use lots of metals and all of those in high proportions. And interestingly, the emergent alloy that comes from mixing all of them together tends to have properties, physical properties, that are completely novel and absent in any of the metals that make it up.
Right. Yeah.
Even like the crystal lattice of like what's called a high entropy alloy with five or more metals. There's like classifications for the different type of
Mm-hmm.
crystallographic groups
Mm-hmm.
that atoms can form in materials. And maybe many of the components of the high entropy alloy may have a certain symmetry, like, hey, they prefer like, to simplify it, kind of like triangular symmetry. And then collectively, when you put them all together as a group, maybe now they prefer square symmetry. So it's kind of this
Yeah.
completely emergent, unexpected thing. And then on top of that, yeah, if you interweave a material very, very finely, you can actually use it as a lens, which is like mind blowing that you can have like this like flat material, but it effectively bends light as if it was a lens.
Wow.
A bunch of things that just you need to kind of like go deeper to really encounter and realize, oh my gosh, this breaks
Yeah.
every naive model. It's the same with consciousness. Like I think I went through a period in high school and college, especially early college, where I thought like I think I may have figured this out, and that's just completely like no, man, you absolutely have
Yeah.
not.
You bring up so many interesting things, and again, some like one thread leads somewhere I know we went last time. One thread leads somewhere we didn't go last time that I wanted to come back to. So I'm going to go down that road this time. So this thread that I was saying I wish we would have explored last time is when you said metamaterials. You may know where I'm going with this. Is like that. That's actually what they call some of the anomalous alloys they've found having to do with UFOs, right? And people like Dr. Gary Nolan from Stanford have tried to look at these things. Other material scientists have had to try to look at these things. And while they say that these, so for people that haven't seen it, like there are these chunks of metal that are some of them are arranged in single atomic layers, which is something from my understanding, I have no idea. I know nothing about like, you know, high level engineering of metals, but apparently this is something that could be possible, but very, very difficult, like to arrange layer by layer, atom by atom layers of metals. And
Mm,
apparently the idea is like these are recovered pieces of material from an anomalous craft, and then they'll take a little broken chunk of it and they'll give it to somebody and say what what sense can you make of this. So that's an interesting avenue in and of itself. But the second thing this makes me think of that I want to just lob up in the air too is there's this really interesting relationship between the esoteric and material. And you really run into this with alchemists, like people like Zosime. Have you heard of Zosimus of Panopolis?
no.
Um, he's just such an interesting character because I think he's one of the earliest alchemists' writings that we have. And he is both like an Egyptian initiate of all of the, of like Egyptian priest, but he's also he's considered both a technical and philosophical hermeticist, meaning that he's doing actual alchemy, and he's like making sacred statues and doing rituals and do all and all this stuff, and he's writing these very technical directions on how to do these things. And then in the very next page he'll be talking about going into an altered state of consciousness where he's encountering gods and beings and seeing symbols, like almost like something out of Jung's Red Book or something, and he's somehow downloading that information and turning it into alchemical recipes. And people like him were obsessed with certain alloys. Like they would talk about electrum, and they would talk about combining different alloys, that almost as if there's this other layer of meaning that emerges when you make these alloys. And it's ways that we do not think about material science at all anymore. Like we just think of it strictly from um, operational physical stuff. But it seems like at some point in human history, at least, there was some other layer of meaning and understanding over the top of material science. And I don't know if maybe something like it, maybe and I think the missing link here with the UFO thing potentially could be some kind of consciousness based technology. And I'm going way past like what probably makes sense at this point in the conversation, but I'm just going to leave all that right in front of you and see what it does for you.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I mean, to address some of the things that you raised, I mean, I think like atomic level control is definitely one of the things that you can put kind of on a list of civilizational development milestones. I guess like the Kardashev, scale
Mm-hmm.
focuses a lot on kind of like spatial extent, right? Like
Yeah.
expansion and amount consumption of energy. You could also think of like maybe a scale having to do with like domain over the atomic realm. And it seems that human manufacturing techniques are generally speaking statistical, rather than that, hey, you add this amount of this substance, this amount of this metal, you put them in this temperature, and then you let it crystallize. And it's like, yeah, you're piggybacking off of thermodynamics and like using kind of entropy to like mix things and then consolidate them, distill them, etc. But you could imagine, like, well, if you have like molecular tweezers, you could potentially
Right.
actually build a material one atom at a time. Like if you know exactly where the copper atom and where the nickel atom like is, it gives you such a finer level of control that is just way bigger than just being able to mix them in some random way and hoping for the best. Things such as like spacing them at regular intervals to be able to tune into particular you know electromagnetic frequencies,
Hmm.
or even the more speculative aspect of these materials that I find fascinating is messing with the topology of the
Right.
fields of physics, but especially the electromagnetic field. That is not just a matter of like, well, where is the positive and negative charge? How are they distributed? Is also how do the field lines, twist and turn, and what kind of shape do they trap around in loops? And like that is like so specific to the very low level details of the material. That is something that has huge, top down emergent effects, and also presumably something that you could engineer with advanced technology. So yeah, I've been following the topic, and it really does seem very weird. Like some of these materials really do seem to be engineered, as far as like, yeah, people like Gary Nolan are concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, my problem is always, you see these fascinating things like whether it's a metamaterial or three eye atlas or just whatever the thing of the week is. And my problem is I don't have the technical understanding in something like astrophysics to have an opinion on something like three eye atlas.
Yeah.
Um but so there's always that issue where it's just, yeah, that does seem weird, but there's like this level of um it could be a crazy level of psyop sophistry that's here's the technical figurehead. Like, I'm not saying Avi Loeb is a psyop agent, not saying that, but I'm saying if you did want to do a really sophisticated psyop, you could have someone that's so intelligent and so smart that they could come forward with a technical argument that makes sense and goes way over the head of the layperson, and everybody would go, who wants to believe, would go, oh, this super expert on this says this could be a UFO or this could be anomalous, and average Joe like me does not have the ability to know if that's right or wrong or what the weaknesses or strengths of that argument is. It's just, oh, this is sexy and this guy's an expert, so sure, I'll believe that. And that's always the problem with all of the technical stuff, which, one, I'm glad people like you are out there who are more well versed in the math and have other people they work with, so you can collectively look at things and make your own conclusions. But two, that's also why I'm so much more interested in consciousness and phenomenology, because then you can rely on your own experience and you can explore your own um, consciousness and relationship to something like non-human intelligence or altered states, and you don't need other people to, like, say we've got the smoking gun little piece of detritus here or whatever. I mean, I guess so. We started out with physics, and then we started out with consciousness, then we got into physics, then we got into like material science and all these other things. But I do think that there's a potential link there, because I started to hint at it, which is that I think there could be some kind of key to a kind of technology we've lost touch with, where consciousness interacts with it. And it seems like, if you're going to put any stock in any of these stories, that there's always that kind of a missing link. It has something to do with
Yeah.
consciousness interacting with machinery. Like this word
Yeah.
psionic has become really big lately. And I just watched my buddy Jesse Michaels just put out this incredible interview with this guy. I'm going to forget his name, but I know he wrote the book Above Black,
Hmm.
and he was a an Air Force officer who apparently got roped into some secret NSA project, and it all had to do with mental communication with some other entities. Basically, he had to go through this really rigorous training. He figured out his brain had some kind of genetic disposition where he could go through this training and make this contact. And one, that is so adjacent to so many things you and QRI, have thought about and researched, particularly through the lens of psychedelics, but not only psychedelics. And again, it could be one of these links between technology and consciousness. So what how do you think about that? Do you think there could be, have you seen any evidence of how consciousness could be linked with technologies more directly?
Yeah, no, okay. So much to unpack. Maybe I'll,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah, yeah.
I'll start with a quick disclaimer, which is I'm fascinated by ufology and like everything in that space. Um, I was actually first introduced to it by I think like Leslie Kean like 10 years ago, like reading her book on how like general like military generals and pilots come out about like their weird experiences and like
Hmm.
you start reading the book and you start very skeptical and then like you see all of these quotes and all of this super high quality investigative journalism and it's like no way, like this is like what the hell. Like this is
Right.
so weird. um but I kind of like filed it in the back of my mind. Is like, well, I'm still, I have no, I really don't know. But I think it was last year actually encountering the Soul Foundation videos that like for me was a bit of kind of a breakthrough. In particular, the presentation of Kevin Knuth
Hmm.
um, at Stanford, I think 2023 or 2024, where he essentially outlines just how like all of these different high quality measurements of some of these objects show like accelerations that are like 5,000 g's, like it's things that
Yeah.
would completely obliterate any human craft or like really almost any object that we can think of, and like these objects seem to be completely unaffected. And then also they can enter water as if it was just air, like transmedium travel. Anyway, this I think there's like a lot of like super legitimate like very weird things that seem to be happening. um I do like Bernardo Kastrup's speculations that indeed a piece of the puzzle is idealism, that like like maybe UFOs indeed are actually kind of like conscious beings, like not
Yeah.
necessarily. I don't know. There's definitely this trope I've seen in like New Age circles where they say we tend to think the flying saucer is the machine and the little entity inside is the actual alien, but it actually might be flipped over. Like the craft itself might actually be the consciousness and the little guy inside is kind of like a dummy, you know
Hmm.
distraction, really, kind of like a
Yeah.
psyop for us to kind of like be misled and think like, oh, these are biological beings, where it's like, no, they're actually these super advanced material science subjects. So yeah, I'm open to that. I still find it really really hard to reconcile with like everything else I know about the universe. But I should also mention that there's like big overlap as well with like especially some of the more kind of like psychic flavored kind of like psychedelic and meditation experiences, of which I have a wide enough network of people who explore these deeply that anecdotes just filter my way to
Yeah.
me like fairly often. And again, like 10 years ago I would have dismissed the field out of hand, but these days I take it very seriously. There are like maybe some non-trivial useful things to say here. Maybe as a high level clarification, I'll uh, address one of the early questions that you provided, because it seems important at this stage, which is like what is consciousness
Yes,
and
yes.
how do I think about this. um, the word consciousness has like many meanings. When somebody says, hey, I'm studying consciousness, I usually can be fairly certain they're studying something interesting. And so like, bring it on. It doesn't matter like whether it's like social awareness or cognition or metacognition, memory, attention. A lot of people use the word consciousness for all of those things, which is fine. However, at QRI, when we talk about consciousness, we usually are referring to what I would argue is kind of the philosophically kind of like deeper or upstream question of essentially like what is qualia, what is the way in which experience presents
Yeah.
itself, the blueness of blue, like what is that and how is that possible to emerge out of like a bunch of atoms interacting with each other. um and So we kind of like the main problem that we're trying to address is mapping out the space of all possible experiences, their subjective quality and the interrelationships between those subjective qualities. Like, how is the blueness of blue related to the spiciness of hot pepper? What is
Yeah.
the map of all of these sensations and its mathematical structure? Also, like, how is it possible that all this information can come all at once? What is called the binding problem.
Right.
How if the world is made of atoms and forces, in principle there really isn't anywhere where the information congregates and like it's presented all at once. Information is distributed, but our consciousness seems to have kind of this all at once quality. Your visual field is rich, and you see the left and the right side at the same time. They contextualize each other. And then, yeah, the fourth characteristic, succinctly, is the causal properties of consciousness. Like, clearly consciousness is doing something. Like,
Mhm.
biology recruited it for some task. We suspect it's computational, like information processing purposes. And you've got to be able to articulate, like, what exactly is a moment of consciousness accomplishing, from the point of view of the organism. Why would the organism bother to create this mini world simulation of the environment and paint it with qualia, right? Like, why is that the case? And I think the idea, any sophisticated theory of consciousness should be able to recognize these questions and actually have like a way of addressing them. And
Yeah.
typically what we find is that a lot of the reason people talk past each other in the science of consciousness is that their explananda, like the set of things that they have to explain, varies from researcher to researcher. And I swear, like, for some people, like, all they're trying to explain is things such as, like, what is the input output relationship. Like like, hey, like, you show, the color blue in a screen, and you ask what color is it, and you respond blue. For some people, like, the question there is like, hey, how can a frequency of light induce this response? Right?
Right.
Like, and if that is what you're trying to explain, like, you're not really studying consciousness, in my opinion, right? Like, what you really should try to explain is, like, how does the blueness of blue arise, right? And you can actually dissociate that from the input. The most straightforward example is, if you let's say, like, you could be blind but have synesthesia from audio to color in such a way that you can explore possible phenomenal colors without ever using light,
Hmm.
just tuning sounds, right? So that example shows you is that it is not the case that the feeling of colors in your visual field is intrinsically tied to frequencies of light. Actually, it may not have anything to do with light at all. Um, Really, the quality of the colors of the visual field is how your brain represents frequencies of light, but is not frequencies of light inherently.
Yeah. Not
You,
the
you
thing in itself. Yeah.
you can have a very rich, colorful dream, right? Like, you're not getting stimulated, your eyes are closed, the room is dark, um, and so having that, dissociation, realizing, like, hey, like, the structure of the input, the type of the input, is not strictly constraining the type of experience that triggers. Like, there is some programmability in that pattern, allows you to understand that, hey, you could actually study consciousness independent of the input. Like, I would argue, somebody with audio to color synesthesia can study the geometry of color without ever seeing any light. And I would argue the same with, like, an alien, or, a DMT entity. If they can experience phenomenal color, even if they have no eyes, they can still run experiments. They can try to, like, map out, which colors are closest to which colors in terms of just noticeable differences, or kind of
Hmm.
like mini steps that you have to take from one to the other. And I would bet that actually the geometry of that space is universal. It is actually kind of like Platonic. Like,
Yeah.
there is a Platonic state space of colors. And I think, like, hey, it's the same no matter who you are, because these are, like, the features of consciousness. They're kind of like the paint flavors of consciousness. Like, that is like, hey, there's only so many you can sample from, and that's a universal feature. How they're put together to construct a mind, yes, that's going to be very idiosyncratic and different from, one organism to the other. um, but yeah, I would you know advocate for this notion that, like, hey, actually consciousness is a very universal phenomenon. It's kind of like fire, right? Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
yes,
Hmm.
fire, if it happens in Jupiter, like, maybe the precise gases that compose it are different, but the actual phenomenon is the same, right? And you can study fire at Jupiter, you can study fire on Earth, you're going to get the same results, once you account for differences in gases and so on. I think it's the same with consciousness. Whether you're on LSD or in a meditation retreat, or whether you're an alien or an animal, it is kind of like, well, as long as the organism is generating experiences, it is kind of this universal phenomenon of consciousness as kind of fire or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the flame may be a different color, but it's still the same phenomenon. You can study it in that sense.
Yeah. And I think that that's just such an apt way to talk about it, because there's so many ancient examples too of there being like this primordial vital fire or vital isness consciousness that pervades everything, like the Greek pneuma or the Indian why am I drawing prana? There we go,
Oh, prana.
prana.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so yeah, I definitely which breath, fire. It's like it's this thing that um we all, I think, seem to intuitively understand or encounter through the experience of consciousness, like somehow getting to this root floor experience of just like this um tindering of unity or energy or perception at like the most basic level or something like that. And I think it is important to just kind of zoom in or zoom out or both on qualia and why this is such a central important um, part when we're talking about consciousness in general, because the way that we want to or are programmed to talk about and think about consciousness is so material and neurological and brain based, and none of those things ever address the actual phenomenology or what it's like to experience something. And this is what qualia does, right? Like, this is really zooming in on none of those things have the explanatory power to to get at what it's like to taste vanilla or see blue or feel the wind on your face. It's like, yes, we know all of these things in the organism are involved, the nerves, the neurotransmitters, the blah, like the blah 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 blah. Of course, all of it is involved, but none of it is causative. None of it contains those secondary qualities or those what it's like to experience something. So this leads people like Federico Fagin, for example, to just kind of, I don't remember if he likes dual aspect monism or if it's Castrup or if they both do, but he sort of goes down this route, right? Where he says, okay, essentially consciousness exists in this, in qualia exists in this quantum space, and you have this identity in this quantum realm, and then you as your physical body also exist as a sort of projection of that thing, and then the brain is kind of like this bridge mechanism that allows this satiety, as Federico calls it, to project into a sort of material form or something like that. So that's one way to address this thing. But so before, you said you're sort of on board with a lot of what he puts forward in Irreducible. Do you think it's something like that, or how do you think about this relationship between subjective experience and the physical organs that are having the conscious or facilitating the conscious experience on the physical level or something?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I think like an apt metaphor here is, if you want to go to the moon,
Mm-hmm.
sounds maybe this is coming out of the blue, but it's gonna make sense in a second. Like, for some people, naively, they may think, hey, to go to the moon, all you really need is a vehicle that can overcome Earth's gravity.
Yeah.
Escape velocity, achieve escape velocity. But if it's not modeling like the fact that there's an atmosphere where
Yeah.
hey, friction, right? Like, there's an aspect of the problem that maybe you're not taking into account, or worse, where like you may not know that there's no air in space, right? So actually you need to make the vehicle airtight or you're gonna suffocate on the way there. And so there's a lot of like things that you need to do that may not be obvious at the beginning. And I think, when it comes to theories of consciousness, that is overarchingly, I think, what is happening in a lot of discussions is that people realize, well, there are some things that have to be explained, but the list of things that have to be explained may be different than yours, and typically, I would argue, in most cases is incomplete. Like, they may say, like, okay, I've got to explain, like, or like, in the metaphor of like fire, like if you're gonna try to explain like what is fire, is like you can say like, well, fire is that which causes shadows, right? But it's like, no, 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 like fire
Yeah.
also is like hot, and also like it moves upwards, and it has this like weird convection thingy, and has different colors, and like really pay attention to the phenomenon. Like, don't neglect some of these other like more nuanced features, because they're also part of the puzzle. And yeah, when it comes to consciousness, like I think a lot of people's kind of like, what is it that you have to explain, might involve, yeah, things such as like, hey, how is the brain able to solve like a classification tasks or like clustering tasks? Maybe you see it through the lens of machine learning or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
um, Whereas I think like really you need to address this whole huge list of constraints that are really subtle and weird and nuanced, and actually some of them are like difficult to articulate, such as like like this paradoxical superposition of like unity and multiplicity that consciousness has, right? It's like you have one experience at each point in time, but even though it's one, it has many pieces of information at once, right? Like that's not common, right? Like most objects in physics is like the object as a whole is really just the sum of the parts. So like you can really, you can just make sense of the object by kind of like partitioning it and studying each of the parts independently. With consciousness, that is clearly not the case. Like a moment of experience is completely interdependent, right? Like what you see in the upper left corner of your visual field influences the meaning of what you see in the bottom right corner. Like they're all
Right.
entangled and interconnected. And that quality, this kind of like everything reflects into everything else, is something you have to explain. And yeah, most theories of consciousness just don't even go there, or like don't list it as something that you have to do. And I would analogize this actually with like very important breakthroughs in physics. I mean, if you think about like how electromagnetism was developed, 19th 18th centuries, like a lot of people were really working under the premise that the universe was just made of atoms and forces, right? And like uh but there are like some things that happen in electromagnetism where you can show that this is not the case, because you can, a circuit can be influenced even if there's like a gap where like you're not exchanging any particles, as if kind
Right.
of like there was like this invisible force that is
Yeah.
influencing the field as well, and or influencing the mechanism of the circuit. um and it's really just only when you take into account those weird phenomena that you realize like, okay, atoms and forces just do not cut it, and you need to switch the ontology to what now is considered like field
Radio. Yeah.
dynamics,
Right.
like that the universe is actually made of these kind of yeah sheets, like where every point is connected to their immediate neighbors, and it's a continuum, and it evolves according to differential equations. That's, I mean, now we take it for granted, but like that as like an idea for like an explanatory framework was utterly mind-blowing and revolutionary at the time, right? It's like, hey, you could actually describe everything in terms of differential equations. And it, it's a figure ground inversion, right? Like from that perspective, let's say an electron, you stop thinking of it as a particle,
Right.
and instead you actually start seeing it as really just a point in the field where the field lines converge, right? It's almost kind of like the electron is an expression of the field rather than
Yeah.
being a thing in itself, right? And I would argue, well, what a lot of what happens in consciousness is like, well, in the background of people's metaphysics, they are thinking of the world as atoms and forces, and then trying to come up with an explanation where that is the ground. And what will happen is that, well, because it's impossible, like you cannot actually come up with an explanation for consciousness with a universe just made of atoms and forces. When people use that as a constraint, it's like, no, that's my explanatory power. What ends up happening is that they end up not paying attention to the features of consciousness that go against that metaphysics or that ontology, and they become very blinded. It's almost kind of the theory dictates the facts as opposed to the facts dictating the theory.
Yeah.
I'm also reminded of the apocryphal but like still valuable anecdote of like Galileo telling the Pope and the cardinals, like, hey, just look through the telescope. And then the cardinals saying, like, I don't need to look through the telescope. The Bible already tells me what is true, right? There's something like that having to do with consciousness. I mean, meditation
Yeah.
retreats or DMT and stuff like that is like, hey, that will give you information that will
Yeah.
break most models, like for sure.
Yeah,
But yeah,
man.
the typical neuroscientist is going to say like, well, I already know how the brain works. I don't need to look through that telescope.
Right. Yeah. And it's just so crazy that we have this infinite telescope inward or into consciousness or like whatever. Even how you, God, I mean, even how you frame that really kind of colors what it is that you're experiencing. Like what is it that you're peering into the air quotes consciousness telescope into when you sit down and you close your eyes and you modulate your breathing and you start to just see some swirly colors, and then you start to like you do that over and over and over and over again, and then maybe one day you'll go out of body, maybe one day you'll encounter what seems to be another intelligence. And even what assumptions about reality you're making going into those states colors
Yes.
what maybe not what's going to happen, but how you interpret what ends up happening and how you make
Yeah.
sense make what ends up happening. But before we go into that, because I do want to just hear your thoughts in general on that, because that's so interesting.
Yeah.
When you mentioned, I do want to like just linger on how incredibly magical and mind blowing the and just the ontological weight of really focusing on this idea that it seems like the preponderance of evidence is telling us that reality really is what you describe. It's a series of fields. It's not what it appears to be as distinct stuff that's like
Yeah.
running around bumping into each other. It's like the hyparxis, the higher ontological reality and causative power is within these fields. And again, this kind of ties back into Fagin, because he would say that's exactly what a person is. A person is like the visible electron that's measured, but behind that there's this whole field that is electronness, right?
Yeah.
And that's what your consciousness is too. It's like this thing that lies beyond this physical um manifestation of you. And even if you don't want to go to that level, just the idea that there are, not only are there these fields, we've like figured out how to like encode information into these fields using, information technology. And it's just so mundane now that we don't even like give it a second thought that, radio waves flying across the air are allowing this conversation to occur, that are, encoded with like TCP IP and all these other protocols that allow us to like put information into high throughput video and audio feed. It's so insane, man. It's so fucking insane and magical. And I was thinking back to like the time of like Tesla and Marconi and these people who really figured out how to do this stuff for the first time, and just how reality breaking that must have been at the time, that suddenly you can just hear someone's voice from miles and miles away through a little speaker. And now we've just come so much further, but it's become so mundane at the same time. And it makes me just wonder, what is the next breakthrough on that level going to be? It's probably AI, but yeah, I'll leave it there again with that smorgasbord.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. I mean, it is absolutely the case that your preconceptions of reality influences what unfolds in consciousness. Um, if you think the world is made of atoms and forces, and that's like your kind of like base ontology, usually that actually will subtly manifest in how you see yourself and how you see the world, and what unfolds even in a psychedelic experiences is very common for example, in psychedelic experiences. I would argue like people's ontology and metaphysics kind of like bubbles up to the surface, like that it was like very implicit before, but then they're, hey, because everything is breaking down, the brain is making all these last ditch attempts of like, okay, based on what I understand of how the universe is constructed, how can I make sense of these?
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a classic kind of like unpleasant nihilistic experience, like if you, let's say, go through like Reddit r/atheism, right? Like
Right.
people, yeah, like devout atheists who take mushrooms. I mean, oftentimes they have maybe like a Carl Sagan type
Yeah.
experience, like of wow, like the wonder of the universe. But oftentimes also they have like very unpleasant nihilistic experiences, because if you perceive yourself as just this bag of molecules, and with there's nothing fundamental that has value, we're just replicating according to evolution. We're just a bunch of competing replicators, and like if you see the universe that way, like that really shapes your experience from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're accessing the subconscious in a specific way with a specific angle, expecting specific things, and it's very different. Yeah, if instead you have like a mindset or a model of like, well, the universe is actually made of fields, you recognize the field quality of experience that actually unlocks and opens up a whole realm of like new ways of seeing yourself. Um, one additional example here is like, if you think of like the the cognitive style of, let's say, people who are like in the Asperger's spectrum, or like a
Mm-hmm.
little bit autism, high functioning autism, autism level one, let's say, uh, versus like people who are like very very I don't want to say like normies, because like, yeah, that doesn't really capture it, but it's more like much more like a kind of like normal in the in the sense
Yeah.
of like common psychological makeup, where like the mind reading, they don't have like the same mind reading difficulties, but also they're not hyper systematizers. um how it is not only that they see people differently, but also they see themselves differently, right? It's
Hmm.
very common. I have a lot of friends with Asperger's, and like almost them actually describe themselves as like sometimes like a computer. It's kind of like their
Okay.
own model of their own mind is like based on software and computation. Whereas let's say like somebody who's like much more kind of like lovey-dovey, empathetic, like mind reading, they tend to see themselves and others in terms of feelings, like objects with feelings, as opposed to like, oh, you're instantiating a program or you're instantiating some kind of algorithm. And that lens is like how you approach who you are really constrains like what will unfold, right? And so
Right.
a lot of the power, I think, like of some of the meditation retreats on the of the more new age spiritual type is allowing you or giving you the permission to reframe how you see yourself. Or like if you spent a week seeing yourself as like, oh, you're a timeless being, you're like made of infinite love, you're made of infinite energy, it's like, gosh, that absolutely is going to impact your experience
Yeah.
very profoundly, and oftentimes in really beneficial ways. Of course, you've got to, yeah, develop good epistemology, and just because something is powerful doesn't mean that it's true, and
Right.
so on. But yeah, like I think a lot of the difficulties that, yeah, we have in terms of making progress in consciousness, precisely these implicit background assumptions about what the world is made of, that very often are actually just false and outdated. But people are under the impression that that is like what a rational, well-educated person like should believe, which is,
Hmm.
yeah, very, very, very misguided.
Yeah. Well, that's just such an interesting hinge point in the conversation because, you can play with all of these different ontological lenses and you can look at what it seems like all the evidence is pointing to and what theories resonate with your personal experience and biases and intuitions and all of that stuff. Um, but like, I'm suspecting that you do gravitate more toward this idea that what's, you know, more real is probably these fields, right? And that the physical world is Plato's cave style. Maybe it doesn't mean it's not real, but it's deeper into the cave than the field, right?
Yeah,
Um, but then how do you think of the nature of those fields? Is it do the fields themselves have a kind of consciousness? Are,
yeah.
are the fields themselves based on mathematical geometric principles, both? How do you think about that?
The disclaimer that I'm not a physicist. I don't have like a physics graduate degree. I mean, I wish, maybe I'll go back to school and and do a physics PhD sometime down the line. I'm really a big fan, right? I read
Hmm.
books and I talk to ChatGPT a lot, trying to make sense of, what is what is a spinor, and like, what is the SU3, symmetry group for the standard model. Like, I have like moderate knowledge. I would say
Yeah,
I'm not an expert. I definitely more than a beginner, but like moderate. And
sure, sure.
um, so um, when it comes to like quantum fields, there's a lot of misconceptions, and I am hesitant to go as far as, like maybe like Federico Fagin might go to say like, hey, consciousness is actually the quantum fields, because it is actually like very hard to find like a correct mapping here, for the following reason: that like the wave function in quantum mechanics is not actually kind of like a wave in 3D space, and that's just a very common misconception, because if you look at like a double slit experiment with an electron, you think like, okay, Schrodinger's equation, as you evolve it creates these interference patterns, and then
Yeah,
intuitively you imagine it's like, well, if there's a bunch of particles, just apply the Schrodinger equation and see how the interference patterns work. But here's the problem, though: the Schrodinger equation actually is not something that is applied over a three-dimensional space. It is something that is being applied on a 3n dimensional space,
yeah,
where n is the number of particles involved. So the actual dimensionality of the universe, according to classic, vanilla quantum mechanics, is, 10 to the 80, 3 times 10 to the 80 dimensions. This is not like a 5-dimensional or a 10-dimensional universe. It's like a unbelievably high dimensional space
Right.
where every point in that space corresponds to an entire configuration of the entire universe. And
Mm.
most of those don't interfere or talk to each other because they're too far away. But universes that are very similar, except for maybe one atom is slightly misplaced, interfere with each other. And that is what the Schrodinger equation is actually like allowing you to predict, is like how the probability mass, as it were, of all possible configurations evolves over time, which is
Wow.
um so it's like how can that actually correspond to consciousness, right? It's like it's a field where it's
I don't
not
know.
pockets in space, it's more like pockets in possibility space that include the entire universe. So that's why I don't think it's going to be something like clean and obvious, like, hey, like just look at the properties of the quantum wave function and like read that, and that's where consciousness is. I think we will need like substantially more work for how to actually like decode the wave function and extract from it what the actual pockets of causality are, and actually say like, okay, this region of reality can see itself, but it cannot see the rest that may correspond to a pocket of reality. um, and on top of that, you know, it is not even the case that like in physics is like well understood like why we live in three dimensions, because um, these the experiments show that the Standard Model and Schrodinger's equation are extremely accurate, but they can only verify this for like very few number of particle systems. Like a few electrons, or like by the moment you have like dozens of electrons or hundreds, it becomes computationally intractable to like really make sense of it. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of like why we have the illusion that like, well, maybe it's going to be something simple, like, yeah, consciousness is just quantum fields. But I think we will need like an extra layer of like interpreting the quantum fields to extract the topological structure and then identify within those pockets which ones correspond to consciousness. I think more something along those lines.
Hmm. Yeah, and this gets deeper into I mean, uh, a territory where I think I said this last time, but I'm just like woefully under skilled, which is math and geometry in general. And it seems like, whether you're pursuing this on an esoteric front, even, or a more rigorous philosophical and scientific front, you're going to eventually run into these complex geometric structures. You're going to run into it within your own consciousness in terms of like psychedelic experiences. You're going to run into it within mathematics. You're going to run into it within physics itself, right? I mean, and again, like whatever like geometric assumptions we're making about reality are also hugely important, right? Like, okay, reality is space time, and then that creates this sort of like grid like structure that we're very used to sort of you know doing sort of like relativity based work on reality with, right? But so how do you think about that? Is that just a function of how human beings interact with the world, or are we glimpsing into a more fundamental layer of reality, or beginning to understand something more fundamental about reality?
Yeah, yeah. I think what I'll say is like, I mean, I think our intuitions of space and time um, are specific to our standard state of consciousness. Um, like we evolved to essentially create and inhabit a world simulation that has Euclidean geometry. It's like a three spatial dimensions and one dimension of time, and
Yeah.
it's like Euclidean, and kind of like the layering of sensations is finely crafted in sober experiences to essentially generate that metric, generate that like the type of distance functions that are characteristic of something like just Euclidean geometry. Um, but if you take DMT, as I have argued, a lot of actually what ends up happening is that the geometry of your experience becomes hyperbolic.
Right.
This the most extreme way and well most obvious way in which this manifests is that usually if you have a two-dimensional surface, you can only cover it with a few shapes. In particular, you can only cover it with hexagons, squares, or triangles. Why? Because if you use pentagons, the angles at the corners, they don't add up to 180, 100, 200, sorry, 360 degrees, right? Like there's a little bit of a gap, and you just can't close it without like overshooting. Um, However, in hyperbolic geometry, you can actually have like a surface being tessellated by any shape you want. I mean, heptagons, for example, or like
Mhm.
10-sided polygons, and that where the angles add up to more than 360 degrees. And DMT hallucinations are like replete with those. Above a certain dose, you may enter like a palace, for example, where the walls are covered with heptagons and there's just no distortions. It looks like a very big space, and it's hard to explain what that bigness comes from. But once you realize, like, oh shit, actually the walls are covered with heptagons, that means this is a hyperbolic space.
Mm.
It actually grows exponentially as a function of the distance. Um, and Kant famously talked about how space and time are kind of like our vehicles for knowledge, right? Is a kind of like a feature of how the mind is put together, with which we then use to organize sensations right
Right.
next to each other. He wasn't thinking about alternative geometries, but I would argue that it's not the case that like consciousness and the mind necessarily its space and time is like standard Euclidean, because there's all of these exotic states of consciousness with alternative geometry. And if DMT was our default mode of consciousness, I think people would essentially be looking for physics that kind of like have that flavor. They would say like, oh, isn't it crazy how quantum reality is actually this hyperbolic branching thing, and that is like the fundamental like ground level of
Yeah.
reality, because we're trying to find something in the world that fits our the way in which sensations manifest in us. But it's just a super specific corner case. I mean, like we are like the we're like the tiny bacteria living in your teeth, and thinking like, oh, this is what reality is all about, not realizing you're this tiny, tiny, tiny niche, right? Like it's something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, we might be the tiny bacteria in God's teeth, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like the sort of vision that Krishna gives during the Bhagavad Gita, right? When he like reveals his cosmic form and just like melts the brain of Arjuna, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah. I mean, well, but that does bring up an interesting point, because maybe that's what something like DMT does, right? Is it unveils something like a view of reality higher than what the bacteria can normally interact with. And one of the compelling, kind of common sense arguments in that direction is what Gallimore always talks about, right? Like here's a neuropharmacologist, somebody who really understands how the brain works, how pharmacology perturbs the brain and in our view of reality. And it's not like it just instantly takes hold, right? It's just something that so quickly and instantly alters your view of reality. And it's just like your brain doesn't need to like download some new template, even though it's as alien as it can possibly be and different as it can possibly be, and suddenly
Yeah.
it feels like you're just engaging in like psychic contact with other entities, or like living geometry, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just it's almost like all of these veils just suddenly get ripped off reality, and you're existing in a on a higher plane or something like that. It's not just like um it's not something that's just a one riff off of the reality we're used to, and it's like the brain scrambling, making mistakes or something. It's really like, okay, I'm suddenly something else somewhere else, with all these other capacities, like hundreds of other senses and capabilities I didn't even have before.
Yeah. No, Andrew Gallimore, yeah, fan of his work, and yeah, reality switch technologies,
Mm-hmm.
his latest book. And I've talked to him. I've had the privilege of like at a number of different events, bumping heads with
Yeah.
him, or giving presentations to the same audience with him. And um, one thing that I really like about his approach, that I would say is kind of like overlapping with a lot of the things that I say, is that whether or not some of these entities, you're actually resonating with, something that is out there and is different than just your mind projecting things. Even if that is the case, like it really does seem to be also the case that for these entities to communicate with you, they need to kind of latch on to pre-existing information in your mind. They're like they cannot like fundamentally communicate something completely new. They need to kind of like remix sensations that you've had, like almost as if some of these states of consciousness involving some of the most blatant and like explicit entity contact is almost like your mind is using elements of things that it has seen before to craft a kind of like suit or craft a kind of like interface that then functions as a way for that other consciousness to resonate and interface with you, almost kind of a giving them like gloves and a suit so that they can actually put them on
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
talk to you. And so they're limited to what you know. And I think that is probably one of the aspects for like why it's so hard to test their independent existence, is like the interface is limited by your own capacities and understandings. And if you meditate more, you develop like access to high levels of concentration or jhanas, etc. The DMT experience also changes, and like the palette of available flavors the entities have to
Yeah.
play with to talk to you also expands. I mean, broadly speaking, as an aside, I think if anybody in the audience is serious about exploring psychedelics very deeply, I also strongly encourage developing like various meditative skills, whether it's like high concentration, ability to chop sensations very finely, equanimity, loving kindness. Meditation skills massively synergize, usually in a very good way, with psychedelics. um, and yeah, like it goes to show that whatever you interact with in the broader multiverse, you kind of need to have like a seed of it inside of you to be able to resonate with it. I mean, I guess, yeah, maybe in reference to kind of the, what is it, like the law of attraction? There's definitely something in that direction
Yeah.
having to do with states of consciousness. Um, Loving kindness is also extremely protective. I mean, I've had many experiences of like very unpleasant entities. Most of my experiences are mind-blowingly amazing and pleasant and beautiful, but sometimes I have like like very classic horrifying experience. I mean,
Hmm.
horrifying in the very direct sense. If I were to describe to you and narrativize what happened, people would say like, that sounds horrible and disgusting.
Yeah, right.
but then in
Me too.
practice, actually my experience was pretty bearable and even beneficial. I mean, to give you a flavor of this, there's some experiences on ayahuasca like
Yeah, same.
have
Those are my
involved
worst experiences too. Yeah.
have involved like demonic forces eating me alive, like this
Yeah.
almost kind of like a defection program is kind of like a agitators in politics. Is like you see
Hmm.
some like defectors and you try to kind of overthrow the government. It's almost kind of like there's like some demon programs out there in the DMT realm, in some of the layers or some of the strata, that if they touch you, they're kind of like gonna try to subvert your cells and try to convince your cells like, hey, like, you deserve better, and the organism hasn't been treating you
Yeah.
right. They kind of like, you create a rebellion, but it's a
Interesting.
rebellion of everybody against everybody. And so like it may manifest as kind of these like worms eating you inside out, and then like the worms are eating each other, and it's just this horrible like
Yeah.
hellish all against all. But if during it, I mean, like the typical human reaction is like, oh my gosh, you're ugly, you're horrible, like get away from me. What you've got to understand, and what Buddhists will teach, is that the actual disgustingness, the actual horror of those sensations come from your reaction to it. So if you can actually like have like perfect equanimity and like beam loving kindness and say like, I love you, you still deserve love, no matter how ugly you are, you're still
Yeah.
part of consciousness. Like, you really do it for minutes, eventually actually start to break down, and eventually they actually turn into rainbow light and kind of these like
Hmm.
Buddha figures. So
Wow.
um yeah, it's all of those things is like, yeah, you really really benefit from having like solid meditative chops to deal with these
Yeah.
situations.
Well, I didn't succeed in transmuting the demonic worms into Buddha lights. Unfortunately, but I did have the experience of exactly what you're describing, of almost feeling
Yeah,
like I'm being eaten by some kind of demonic forces. And I think what makes it so much harder with ayahuasca is there's such a um, endemic sense of somatic disease, right? Because it's
Yeah.
purgative. You feel bad for like
Yeah.
a large part of the experience. Like you physically feel sick. And when you physically feel sick, that sort of feeds back into your mental state. And but it
Yeah.
has this utility where when you do eventually get through that, it's like that going down to hell to get going through hell to get to heaven kind of experience, right? Where you can, where it's almost like you need to feel like shit, annihilate your ego, go to this point where you're just at rock bottom. And then there's this like miraculous resurrection kind of thing that can occur. Um, that's what happened to me, at least. It was like the first two were just nothing but on a retreat that I did. The first two nights were just nothing but that dark experience, basically, and being like, I'm never doing this again. This is awful. But then you get through it, and then you're kind of sharing war stories with everybody else, and you're like, of course I'm going to go back the next night. So then you go back the next night, and then for me, by the third night, I had that like really transcendent, unbelievable experience where I won't tell the whole story again because I've told it too many times on the show, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to hijack the conversation. But um, let's go back there. Let's go back
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
potentially being able to reveal layers of reality that are totally foreign to us from our daily experience, right? And it
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah.
the only way we can get to these places is through that inner telescope. Like it seems like there's no other way to get there. And this again, last time we I'm just remembering now that we talked a lot about the utility of Plato's cave, right? Like that even though it's this super ancient um way of looking at reality, it still seems to yield a lot of wisdom. And one of the key pieces of wisdom is that at a certain point, highest knowledge is a mental kind of act. It's not something that you can get purely through empirical rigor. It must be done through the prism of consciousness. Like if you look at the divided line, it's like you start in what this maps onto the cave analogy where it's the way things seem, right? It's the shadows on the wall, and you're just naively thinking that that's what reality is the way what your senses are um, presenting to you. And as you go up that line, eventually you get to dianoia, which is like your logical capabilities, your mathematical capabilities. But then above dianoia is noesis, and noesis is always like the hardest thing to explain, but it's usually translated as like a direct intuitive knowing of something. And
Hmm.
when you start but when you really start to try to unpack what that means and how that can be above dianoia, it becomes harder to understand. But I start to think of things like DMT experiences where it's just like you or any kind of like really altered state where you're directly encountering truths that are so big that you cannot condense them back down into cave form or into any of those lower ways of knowing. They're only things that you can directly experience in that moment, even if they're like melting your brain and you can't wrap concepts around them. It's like them. You just know these things, at least for a short period of time.
Yeah.
And I guess the question then becomes, um, question one, would you agree with putting that kind of knowing as the highest kind? And two, what does that say to you about reality if that is the case?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great question. I mean, one of the ways to kind of like create a hierarchy, in a sense, for consciousness is in terms of kind of like the degrees of how unitive the experience is,
Mm,
how internally coherent, unified, and internally synchronized it is. And I think like maybe that kind of scale where maybe noesis is at the top is very correlated with that dimension, because if you think about like, okay, what is it to like be able to do like mathematical reasoning, and we talked about this the last time we chatted about how I think like, yeah, mathematics is kind of an activity more so than like a real thing in a
mm-hmm,
sense.
mm,
um, that you're actually kind of like dividing yourself and then like reasoning and comparing the different parts of yourself. Like if you're trying to come up with a mathematical proof for a geometric theorem, you're going to be like looking at relationships between points and lines
right.
and circles. That is in a sense like dividing your visual field, dividing your attentional stream, and having those attentional streams interact with each other. You can kind of like measure how fragmented your attention is. We're like, okay, I mean, if you're ADHD, completely distracted, stressed out, is like you're very fragmented. Maybe if you're doing like mathematics or high level reasoning, you're like fairly coherent. And then this deep knowing, I think, involves like very high levels of coherence. I mean, almost kind of like laser like relationships between the elements of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think it deeply connects with is symmetry and invariance. That in some sense, to really understand something is to be able to see it from every point of view at once.
Mm.
And like a superficial understanding is like being able to see a scene from only just one direction. But like deep reach understanding is being able to see the scene from any direction, no matter what, even the ones that you've never seen through the senses. And that, if you think like what is involved in being able to rotate a model internally, is like, well, you have to, whenever you apply a geometric transformation to this object, you also have to apply it to this other object. Like you have to apply
Yeah.
transformations in a coherent global way. I think Noesis deeply, it really is kind of the download of how to relate the objects to each other so you can fit them into the same world. And deeply, I think it will be very connected with, coherence, even kind of like laser coherence in terms of like electromagnetic theories of consciousness, that like a laser like attention tends to have more information about like invariance, about how things are related to each other. And it's very much more holistic as opposed to a fragmented or diffusion like type of awareness or attention, which is more common and also just doesn't feel as good or deep. I mean, like, uh, that is maybe one of the key kind of aesthetics of the QRI
Mm.
enterprise in a sense, is they're like that maybe Plato or somebody might say like, well, Noesis feels amazing because you're deeply connected to God or something like that. And I think there's a place for an explanatory landscape like that. But what I would roughly say is like, well, no, Noesis feels very good because it's a hypercoherent state of consciousness. Like it has this
Mm.
internal harmony and coherence, and that is what feels good. Is not actually the knowing itself that feels good. It's more how the knowing is structuring your consciousness in a way that creates this like very nice, smooth, coherent flow, and that is the thing that feels good.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense because it's almost like this isn't a word that's usually, you know, put over it in terms of English translation, but it almost is like an like a crescendo of a journey of knowledge that culminates in like sort of like an instant epiphany or an initiatory kind of knowing. And that also is, I think, fits in with a lot of what I think was really going on with Platonism, which is that there's probably a hidden initiatory pedagogy that was never written down by Plato.
Mm-hmm.
And, later Platonists believed that, part of the initiation was you had to read all the dialogues and grapple with all the dialogues. And then you'd be ready for like other certain lessons or initiations. And even that divided line kind of implies that, right? That you have to go from being completely uninitiated all the way up to like the rigorous mental training of dianoia, so like mathematical knowing things technically. And then after that there's like another level you can be initiated into, but it can't just be reduced to just some kind of pieces of logic that you're combining together. It's like that, the relationship between chopping and measuring and then bringing them back together in a new and recontextualizing it somehow, in the same way that happens like if you take ayahuasca or DMT. It's like there's the you before and there's the you after. There's like the you that explodes apart into the experience and then recongeals after the experience. And that's a unique, weird kind of like hero's journey kind of knowing that you only can know through going through the whole grammar of the experience. That's like it's like a
Yeah.
level of knowledge that it's hard to talk about, but it's like you only know what it is afterward, and then you still don't really know because you're left to like integrate and sense make a new version of yourself or
Yeah.
or whatever.
I mean, it's telling that, yeah, like it's very common to take DMT, have experiences, then come back, try to report on them. Of course, you don't remember all of it, but you remember a big chunk of it. Oftentimes, you may get the impression of like, okay, yeah, I reported on the most important part. And then you take DMT again, and then you realize like, oh my gosh, there was all of these other aspects of my trip before that I had like kind of like forgotten. Like clearly they left an imprint, but they just had like no, you didn't have any access to it. One reason is that I think like to be able to access memories, you need kind of like to have like tethers that connect experiences that are like intelligible to each other. I mean, maybe it is, impossible to really kind of like feel what salvia feels like when you're sober, because it's kind of an unintelligible state of
Yeah.
consciousness from our perspective. But maybe if you have enough experiences of like low dose, slightly above higher, increasing doses, and you really kind of like make it a point to remember every step along the way, you have a way to kind of like tether to that other very alien state, and you have kind of a mental path for how to get there. Whereas, yeah, when you start exploring, there's all of these islands of experience that you just don't have any way to reconstruct how you got there or how you come back from it. And I do find that over the years, the more experiences that I have, really the more I'm able to remember and put things in
Mm.
the bigger picture. I mean, DMT trips, they're so diverse that like maybe honestly the first like 300 or so,
Wow.
just like it's like every experience was just so radically different. It's like, what is the big map? How can I relate to all of this? But you have enough experience, and then eventually it's like, yeah, well, actually there's like these levels, they have this geometry, there's these correlations between these features. um, and one way I make sense of this is in terms of kind of like holographic plates that function as a recording medium. Okay, like
Mm.
hear me out on this. Like photographs, old photographs with this silver, what is it called, like film, that you can expose it, right? Like you can take a piece of film and expose it with a little bit of light here, a little bit of light there, and then you can see like an overlap of different pictures in the same picture, right? Like in a very analog way. um, I'm going to suggest that kind of every experience is a little bit like that, is a hologram that has been exposed, as it were, and we store that exposure.
Mm.
And when you're having a DMT experience, in a sense, you're bringing together a lot of these like holograms that you have experienced before, and you have them all at once so that they can talk to each other and see each other. Whereas usually we're fairly compartmentalized, like the various memories and schemas that we develop throughout the day, they may never meet each other, right? Like your morning you and your evening you may just never talk to each other. There might be different personalities. On DMT, they're kind of like forced to coexist. Like all of these different aspects of you are simultaneously illuminated, and the holograms are exposing each other. And I think what you're referring to about like this unique knowledge that comes from undergoing a journey, it is something along the lines of having this new hologram that has been exposed to the process of having all the
Hmm.
holograms talking to each
Yeah.
other, right? So it's kind of like a meta hologram that is capturing the interactions of all of the other ones. And there legitimately is a hierarchy of this, which is holograms of a certain order can record interactions of holograms of a lower order. And it does very much feel the case that at least like the normal human kind of hyper hologram that is putting things together is not the highest one that can be. There's like bigger kind of synthesizers that can synthesize much more information as well. And yeah, once that is like strictly reducible. I mean, it's like yeah, going on an amusement park with a film and taking pictures strategically such that like when you reveal the photo, it has enough information that you can remember the entire amusement park.
Yeah.
Essentially, when you're undergoing one of these DMT experiences, yes, the hologram is kind of recording, is getting exposed to this landscape, and then what you end up actually having as a souvenir, so to speak, is this photograph that was exposed to all of these different angles of the experience. And yeah, if the photograph is too alien, too different than anything you've experienced before, it will just be filed in your file cabinet. You're not going to see it for a long while.
True. True. Yeah. This gives me a little bit of a crossroads here because one, I'm remembering something I really wanted to get into with you before. And two, I mean, this conversation about holograms obviously can be zoomed out to the widest possible aperture, like to like theories about how the brain works, theories about what the universe is, like holographic universe theory, like people like Bentov talked about, and like Stalking the Wild Pendulum, and is it Bohm,
Hmm.
who's also famous for holographic universe theory, but also in the conversation about Gallimore and about um, the way alien information presents itself to your mind,
Yeah.
and how the mind somehow chooses, even unconsciously, an image to assign to that alien information is such a fascinating thing. And this gets directly into the conversations about entities, about alien
Yeah.
encounters potentially. And it even gets into um, esotericism again, because when you, I've said this quote on the show before, and I always forget if it's Proclus or Iamblichus, but it's one of the later Neoplatonic um, sages, who was both, a rigorous philosopher, but also doing rituals and doing very magic-y things. They're both what they called theurgists. And they would talk about the phenomenology of theurgic experiences and the way that like deities or entities or angels or gods would present themselves to you. And they actually talk specifically about this, that they present in a way unique to the individual. And that there's like something to do with the individual soul that interacts with the noumena, and there's like some kind of unique presentation that happens to the theurgist. And this seems to be true of psychedelic experiences, like where if if you're archetypally equipped and you've like read Jung and you've read mythology, and you can understand like maybe this is uh an archetype I'm interacting with that's choosing this particular mask. But maybe if it's a very heroic dose type experience, it's like you don't even know what you're interacting with, because it's so alien and so different. But I also talked to, Jeff Kripal, the professor of religious studies um, at Rice University. He's written a bunch of books. Brilliant, brilliant guy. Um, but we had this exact conversation too, and it was really tripping me out when I was talking to him about this, because he said something to the effect of, I believe it's experiences like this are real, whether it's near death experiences, altered state experiences, but I don't believe the experience itself. So when I was digging, like, what do you mean by that? It's like he believes that it's pointing to something real, but he doesn't believe that the phenomenology of itself is real, right? Like the mask the thing is wearing or the way it's
Mm.
appearing. So whether it's a
Yeah.
near death experience or a psychedelic experience, it's pointing to something real. But whatever that thing is, it's like the mind is doing something. There's a matrix keeper who's somehow the gatekeeper, or the daimon that is like showing the image of the thing that isn't really the thing, but is representing the thing in some kind of Jungian or Platonic way or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'd imagine this is something you've thought about, this relationship between whatever that thing really is, the entity really is, and the way that it chooses to present, or the way that your mind projects an image onto it. Like,
Yeah.
how do you think about that negotiation?
I guess, yeah, I'll start with a disclaimer that, yeah, I mean, I remain agnostic about all of these things. The reason, and maybe I'll get it a little bit into this in a second, but one of the key reasons why I do assign like significant credibility to this entity, some of these entities, not all of them, but
Mm-hmm.
some of these entities and intelligences being actually like from a different realm and like different level of reality, and like actually there's somebody there, is not just your imagination, is because of their computational capabilities. That they're
Right.
capable of doing things that I just find really, really surprising. Um, the straightforward example here is uh, what's called like the four color theorem. If you have like a map, a two-dimensional map, like the world, for example, there's a mathematical theorem that says that it's always possible to paint every country with one out of four colors in such a way that neighbors are never of the same color. And this has been proven, but the proof is really long and very complex. Um, and it's actually just very difficult to do. Like if you have a very large map, very very intricate, you may have to spend an afternoon. And if it's like double the size, maybe you will have to spend, a trillion years. So like it really grows very very
Wow.
very quickly, just how difficult the task is.
Hmm.
Or you can make it very difficult. And there's one specific DMT entity or intelligence I call the painters, and I've encountered them like probably 10 times or more. A very specific vibe, very specific kind of approach to reality. And what they love to do is like paint surfaces with colors, neon colors, pastel colors, matte colors, just any kinds of colors. But they love to do like these mathematical things, like
Yeah.
showing a very complex surface and then almost instantly just like painted with four colors. And then again and again and again. And it's like many times per second. And it's like, I don't know where this is coming from. It's a little bit like Stadia or one of these like video games where like you're playing on a very very shitty computer or like a Game Boy, but then like the graphics of the game is super advanced and there seems to be like a physics simulation that is really precise and is like this
Mm.
doesn't seem to be running in my locally.
Right.
This is
Yeah. Right.
maybe
Right. Right.
connected
That's
to
a
a
good,
server.
really good analogy. Yeah.
um, Now I do think like an approach like the computational complexity of these problems is probably what ultimately will carry the most weight in science. And you know if there's a paradigm breakthrough of like people agreeing like, oh my gosh, these entities are real, I think it will come through, hey, there was a key experiment where somebody demonstrated that by contacting these entities they were able to solve a mathematical problem that was impossible otherwise. Like something along those lines is a thing that would really cause a epistemological breakthrough. But you don't need to go all that far to kind of like be suspicious that like, oh my gosh, there does seem to be a kind of demiurge in a sense that is playing with us apparently. And if you go, I guess like the very classic Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism of the tree of life, right? Like where
Yeah.
and I'm not a scholar here, this is my superficial understanding. I did read a Unsung, which is like, this a very funny piece of literature about like the Kabbalah mysticism. I highly
Okay.
recommend, by Scott Alexander. But anyway, that's as far as my acquaintance with that metaphysics really goes. But there's like, this overarching concept of like, well, the light of God at the top of creation
Yeah.
is so
Keter.
bright, it's so intense. It has to be filtered through these kind of
Yes.
angelic realms. And by the time it reaches us, it has been very diluted and diffracted and refracted. And something with me like really resonates with that like DMT is a little bit kind of like getting rid of some of the early filters, and you get like more the
Mm.
light from the upper heavens a little bit like more unfiltered as a possibility. 5-MeO DMT is like really stripping out the entire tree and going to the very top. Like
Right.
it's like really
Hmm.
unfiltered. Like DMT just never gets quite that unfiltered for reasons I think I might be able to articulate, but it just not doesn't go that deep. Um, and I think like some of the one of the crazy mystical experiences that I had, which in retrospect looks very similar to the Lotus Sutra. I'd be happy to go into that, but I mean, one of the things that really emphasized to me, like maybe how this tree of life phenomena seems to happen, is that I'm not a Christian. I grew up in Mexico when I was a kid, and some of my neighbors were like very fanatical Christians. I hope they're not listening to this, but like they're very pushy, and I was
Hmm.
kind of on the receiving end of like very preachy Christianity, which is why as a teenager, I was very on the
Yeah.
our atheism type of vibe.
Me too, actually. I went through that phase very strongly too, and it
Yeah,
wasn't until encountering a lot of thinkers that I felt a lot of kinship with later in life, and that I was like, okay, I'm definitely not atheist. I'm not sure what I am, but I know I'm not atheist. Yeah.
yeah. So exactly the experience that I had. I mean, this was after a retreat where I'd spent like a week really trying to pursue awakening, and like I was very serious. I mean, I'm still serious, but like I was especially determined like
Mhm.
around that time. And one of the things that happened in that series of experiences was kind of like going to this level of reality that is beyond like Brahma or like kind of the one
Mm.
universal God or oneness, and transcend it to more kind of like emptiness realms. Um, which are kind of like beyond oneness, and it's hard to explain, but it's more kind of an integrative approach that takes into account oneness and multiplicity, and like doesn't deny either of the two. It somehow brings them together. And it seems like some of the very advanced Buddhist entities, in a sense, they're more like a collective consciousness as opposed to an individual being.
Mm,
So if you look at kind of the Lotus Sutra, they talk about this kind of like gathering of many, many gods and Buddhas and beings from all dimensions, where the Buddha essentially like shows its awakening and it helps people awaken. And there's this kind of like big ceremony with all of these different entities coming together to help awaken people. And that's something that I experienced even before
wow.
learning about the Lotus Sutra. And to me, it was very clear that like on that level of reality, what the Buddha is a level of reality where actually it's not the entities themselves, but it's kind of like the collective network of consciousness that emerges
Wow.
at this kind of intersubjective level, where that thing knows there is no self, there is no satisfaction, everything is impermanent, because knowledge is holographically distributed across the minds of all of the people, all the entities in there. So it's almost kind of like if there's enough of Buddha nature in a group of entities and you put them all together, that amplifies, and it's kind of the network itself
Mm.
becomes becomes that.
It's like a metamaterial. It's like a
Yeah,
consciousness metamaterial.
100%. Yes, the Buddha realm is a metamaterial of consciousness. Um, and one of the things that really struck me of that particular experience was like the gathering that showed up, like, it had these beautiful like Chinese dragons and these like lattice
Wow.
beings and these dwarves and these titans, but also Jesus was there. and,
Wow.
and I mean, like, it's just a very classic pictorial picture of Jesus from like,
And and this was during a meditation retreat.
this was high dose DMT.
Okay, okay, okay.
It
Wow.
was high dose DMT.
Still, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and in that particular event, like, Jesus was kind of like a witness of this gathering, and like it seems to be like it's one of many of these entities that come together to help awaken people. um but it was like just such a classic kind of like cliche depiction of Jesus, that in the moment it just felt very clear to me. It's like, well, actually there is kind of this light that is divine and beautiful,
Yeah.
transcendent, and then my mind just, the closest thing it gets to it, like, okay, let me put this like label of Jesus on top of that, because it's just
Hmm.
like the closest in my conceptual framework that I can to make sense of that flavor of consciousness. And but my senses was like, well, if I had been educated differently, my mind would have put a different sticker, but like the light would have been the same. Like that is kind of a eternal transcendent thing. Like your interpretive framework is specific to you and conditioned.
Yeah, and particularly maybe if there is any truth to, ancestrally inherited um idea networks or something like that, right? Like it may even go deeper than our individual psyches. Like these might
Yeah.
be symbols that have been handed down across the course of multiple generations. So even if we don't personally feel like, Christianity is not for me, you can't just that simply shake that archetype from your mind's like sense making uh symbol alphabet or whatever. Like it's still going to be in there. um but yeah, I've always been drawn. It's funny, man, to think about these moments where, you know, uh, being a teenager and seeing the Kabbalah tree of life for the first time or something, and not having any of the cultural context necessary to know what that thing was. I mean, it still mystifies me to a large degree when I look at it, but just being attracted to it, right? Like those things that we're weirdly attracted to from a young age, and we keep coming back to and keep coming back to, and they keep deepening and deepening over the course of our lives. And what's so fascinating about that paradigm to me is that it also has a like a fractal or holographic property, like that they think that that's kind of the reducible atomic structure. So like for instance, some of the um in Western esotericism, at least, there is a difference between like Western esoteric Kabbalah and, traditional Jewish Kabbalah. So I'm not sure which one this comes from or if it's both, but there is this idea that you are also a microcosm of that. So similarly to like the yogic chakra structure, you have all of those nodes on the tree of life within you somehow.
Mm,
And
mhm,
some of the
mhm.
meditative practices you do, like there's a famous one called the middle pillar, where you're imagining, that energy radiating down from Keter, the top Sephiroth down through each one, and then you intonate these different names of God through each one, and then you create like a bubble around yourself and stuff like that. So yeah, this idea that, and then you somehow more so resonate with the macrocosmic relationship between your tree of life and everything else's tree of life. Um, yeah, there's another good book too. If you like sort of dense, knowledge dense books that mix with humor, there's a book called The Chicken Kabbalah by Lon Milo Duquette, who's like a lifelong Western esotericist, and that's a really good dive into that whole thing as well. But yeah, back to this conversation about the sort of like hologram, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, do you resonate with like the holographic
yeah,
universe sort of view of
yeah,
things?
yeah, yeah. Let me put it this way. We actually have like a write-up just posted a couple days ago, both at QRI and a blog
Mm,
called Smooth Brains. One of my closest collaborators, Cube Flipper, this amazing person who went to the QRI psychedelic retreats, both Brazil and Canada, and they have a write-up of those experiences. But recently, we've been investigating what's called like fractional Fourier transforms, which is any image you can visualize its frequency domain, essentially kind of its spectrum. I guess like what people are more familiar with is like audio, right? Like if
mm-hmm,
you're playing a song and you oftentimes you render it in a computer with kind of a typical like audio software, you see like the spectrum, right? Like you see like, okay, like which frequencies are active at each point in time, like a spectrogram. You can do the same with images, where like if you have like a lot of ridges that are closely spaced apart, that may correspond to a spatial frequency. So like in time, a temporal frequency is like how many oscillations per second. In space, you have how many, let's say like ridges per centimeter, right? It's like in space, how many times something happens. You can essentially do what's called a two-dimensional Fourier transform on an image where, yes, if there's a bunch of ridges, at a certain spatial frequency, it will show up in there as saying like, hey, there's a bunch of ridges of a certain of that frequency somewhere in the picture.
okay.
If you just look at the spectrum, you don't know where. If you look at the phase as well, then you can actually reconstruct exactly where that is. Um, well, that is actually very, very relevant for holograms because, um, in some sense, a hologram is kind of like a frequency representation of a certain scene. You're kind of like transforming the scene into its frequencies, and then you have a way of decoding those frequencies to put it back together. And what that allows you to do is transform representations from one dimensionality to another. That's very characteristic of like holography broadly. Is like, okay, there's a 3D scene,
Yeah,
you can compress it into a 2D surface.
sure.
So that interaction, we call it, dimensionality interaction. I think consciousness absolutely has that going for it. It's excellent at making representations of a high dimensional object in a lower dimensional space. Like that is really super quintessential to like the computational benefit of consciousness. And in that sense, absolutely consciousness is holographic. The other component is where everything reflects everything else, where like everything is connected with everything else. What's fascinating about holograms is that, like it is not like a standard painting where, if you accidentally, spill coffee on like part of the painting, that part is lost forever, right? Like you just completely got rid of it. In a hologram, if you break a tiny part of it or like a chunk of it, the whole image is still accessible because the whole image is spread everywhere in the
Mm-hmm,
hologram.
mm-hmm,
Really, all you're going to be what's going to be happening is you're going to be lowering the resolution. So you're still going to have the full image, it's just like a little bit more grainy, um, which is a different type of failure mode, right? Like the degradation of a holographic image, you still have like the sense of the outline, even when it's very degraded, which is you could imagine that is like could be very beneficial for the brain. This book called Shuffle Brain has a ton of
oh yeah.
evidence that like this is how the brain works. That, oh my gosh, you can train, this is mind blowing. You can train a salamander to uh, react to food in a certain way. These classic experiments where you tap the plate before you're gonna give it food, and eventually the salamander learns to like look up, when you tap it, um, even before you give it food. And that's like just something that they don't do naturally, and other animals don't do naturally. And it turns out that, I forget the specific species, but I think it was like axolotl, one of these Mexican
Oh, yeah,
amphibians.
yeah, axolotl, however you say
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
One of
yeah.
those and salamanders, these crazy scientific experiments. So they would train the axolotl and then extract a tiny piece of its brain and then surgically implant it in a
Whoa.
salamander. And then the salamander would like look up when you
Wow.
so and it didn't matter which part of the brain you transplant, suggesting that, like, no, actually the knowledge, the karmic patterns of conditioning are spread out holographically in the entire tissue. So there's really
Right.
strong evidence like that is part of the story. And yeah, intrinsically these holograms, like, everything reflects everything else. Like it's an integrated holistic picture, and it's kind of this distributed knowledge, as it were. Consciousness clearly has that feature. In particular, high dose DMT or high dose concentration meditation shows very clearly this feature of everything reflects everything else. Where, like, in
Yeah.
in a high dose DMT experience, you may enter this space called an indrasnet state, where you may see, let's say, like hundreds of eyes, and each of the eyes has a tiny reflection of all of the other eyes at once. And
Mm.
what's fascinating is that if you move one of these eyes, the reflection of that eye in every other eye moves together with it, as
Wow.
if they were just one object, without delay. Right? So it is not the case that there's just kind of like, oh, there's feedback or resonance between these objects, because if that was the case, there would be like some delays and it wouldn't match up. It's like, no, it is an integrated object. It's just one thing. And when you move the eye, you're moving every other part of it, as if, tensegrity, like a bunch of levers put together and just one organism.
Totally.
That is absolutely a holographic feature, like 100%. And yeah, in a recent article, we just went through a bunch of other reasons to suspect that, yes, consciousness is holographic. This is not just a new age fuzzy. It's like,
Yeah.
no, solid scientific reasons to believe this.
Yeah, man. And this is another one of those pieces of wisdom that transcends, ancient mystical traditions and esotericism. And it just seems to be getting truer and truer the more we learn about reality. Like there was that article Sabine Hassenfelder wrote for Time several years ago about how the universe might be a giant brain, essentially, because there are these like extremely similar structures to brain networks that are, when you visualize the universe with like uh, all of the galactic filaments that connect different cosmic structures together, it looks so much like a brain. And then they went on to do other studies, comparing brain regions in regions of, I don't remember what, like, super cluster they were looking at, but it was very, I mean, there are so many very, very similar structures within the universe at large and the individual brain. And I mean, man, that goes back to the, the emerald tablet of Hermes with the as that which is above is like that which is below, what we were talking about with the tree of life, right? Like that you're a microcosmic tree of life within the macrocosmic tree of life, and it's like this self-reflecting holographic process. The Platonists say the same thing, that it's this essentially our physical universe is a reflection of a higher universe, and an individual soul is made of the same substance as the world soul at large. And it's just these same things keep being communicated through different streams, and it seems like we're just proving that more and more and more the more we learn about reality. It's
Mm.
fucking so mind-blowing and wonder inducing.
Yeah, yeah. There's this philosopher, Martinus Thompson. I think, briefly touched upon his work in the previous conversation. He's a Danish mystic. Made most of his work in the 20th century. Uh, and generally, I'm a fan of people who develop rich metaphysics and ontologies of reality, even if it's completely crazy. It's just like a beautiful storytelling in some sense. They may be true, I don't know, but it's very beautiful because he has like these hundreds of detailed diagrams that explain the nature of reality and how the mind of God is
Cool.
like put together.
Love that.
And yeah, like one of the things that he visualizes is precisely that. I mean, this is the holonomic view of being, the great chain of being. I guess people in integral theory also think this way. It's like, well,
Yeah.
we're a bag made of bags, made of bags, and made of cells, which in turn, ultimately are made of atoms and whatnot. But there's these kind of like layers of bags within bags within bags, or bubbles within bubbles within bubbles. What Martinez, might say is that, okay, like when you're getting born and you have a certain karma and so on, you're kind of like attracting entities, or kind of these entities are like one level below, and you're kind of
Mm.
inviting them as hosts. Now, who will enter you and be like join you in your house, so to speak, um, depends on who else you've interacted with before and what you have done. Um, and your personality, your behavior, and so on is ultimately kind of this composite of like your internal society. How all of these different bubbles are
Yeah.
interacting with each other. Do they get along with each other? Do they hate each other? I think a lot of yeah, neuroticism and hate and so on really is just internal conflict that is being externalized. That like really the problem is like, well, there's parts of you that are in disagreement with each other. There's also this sense of this is like a dynamic evolving thing that like if let's say you meditate on love, um, the parts of you that are little bags that maybe are more hatred based, they just cannot tolerate that environment. So like
Yeah.
when you meditate on love, you're kind of like making it hard for the hatred in you to
Mm-hmm.
stay, and it just kind of like exits. So like may just like jump out of you, and you're kind of like purifying the bubbles inside you.
Yeah.
um, I've actually seen this on DMT. Again, huge epistemic caveats. Like maybe this is just tripping out on hallucinations, but then again, I don't know. This is very, very weird. On ayahuasca, um, tuning into this level of reality where I rather than seeing a person, even just kind of as a collection of programs or like personality, seeing a person as really kind of the society of a lot of internal energetic symbols that are like talking to each other,
Yeah.
really kind of like what a person is like the religion of these internal symbols and bubbles, that
Wow.
when they all believe that they are you, the organism as a whole acts coherently because every part is playing the role of being, well, I'm the hand of this person, I'm the eye. And when with cancer or with various mental illnesses, is like there's disagreement about who they want to become,
Mm.
like who they want to be. I mean, it's kind of like a country that is divided and they have different ideas for who the leader should be. Um, it also can be that like, you as kind of like the gestalt, the overseer of all of these entities, if you do a bad job, or like if you're getting drunk every night and like hungover and like you're hurting them and so on, and then let's say you take DMT where like you're turning on the lights and you're allowing them all to see each other, they may kick you out. They may actually like they may like take you down from like the CEO role, and like they may switch
Yeah.
somebody else to be the CEO, saying like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Maybe
you're
that's
not.
why it helps people kick so many addictions, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. It is kind of, yeah, the meta gestalt of the person, in some sense, getting genuine feedback from the subordinates, in a sense, feedback that you just cannot escape, right? Like you can't
Yeah.
pretend you're not seeing it. um and I think like one, actually knowing this has made my meditations like even just so much more powerful, because I don't have the approach of like, hey, let's expel the bad ones, but is more along the lines of recognize and acknowledge the presence and existence of all of these beings inside me, and wishing them love and well-being and liberation. um and I think the fact when they get recognized, actually that really harmonizes you. Like I think a
Mm.
lot of also internal conflict is almost kind of like, yeah, like the CEO that doesn't recognize its its employees, the CEO who takes the credit of like everything in the company, is like, well, no, the CEO is just a tiny fraction of it, it's just the face. Really everybody in the company is producing the juice. Is the same with us, like the CEO gets the credit, but you gotta give credit to all of the
Yeah.
all of the cells that are making that up.
Yeah, that really resonates, and that makes me think of a couple of things again because I apologize for being so skewed toward Platonism, but
Yeah, yeah,
I was reading this book Theurgy and the Soul by Gregory Shaw, who's an amazing. He started out as a yogi, like very intense yogi meditator, had these mystical experiences. Um, Basically stumbled across Neoplatonism and just really loved it. So decided to go back to school, get a PhD. Then he became a I don't remember if it was philosophy or religious studies professor for whole career. Now he's like this really respected scholar of Neoplatonism. He's written a few books, including Theurgy and the Soul and Hellenic Tantra. But one of this idea that I read about in Theurgy and the Soul is that the body is the Greek word is asunthema or sunthemata of the soul. And this really reminded me of what you're saying because it's this idea of like it's your body is almost like this reflection of your soul, of like what your soul is doing.
hmm.
And but depending on like the way you use your psyche, and again psyche is Greek for soul, so it's all interrelated. Depending what your psyche is doing, your body is literally a reflection of that thing. So for the theurgist, right, like they're trying to attract and become a vessel for divinity. And what you're talking about reminded me so much of that, right? Like if you literally embody loving kindness, it reorients your entire being and your body becomes a sunthema for something else, like a symbol
Yeah,
for something else. And you can do that through the will and concentration and repetition of whatever you dedicate your psyche to. And that reminds me then of like the really similar of like the Tibetan Buddhist Yidam practices, right? Where you just like devote yourself to one of those symbolic deities like green Tara or, whatever. And you just meditate in front of that image and that archetype over and over and over again and try to become a conduit for that thing until you suddenly start resonating with that deity and it like literally you become a vessel for that thing. I really think there's something to that idea, whether it's, I mean, 100% at least psychological, if not actually metaphysical. I think there could be something to that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think my most valuable comment here would be actually, yeah, to point out maybe the difference between a deva and a Buddha from this perspective.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think like a deva tends to be a hyper coordinated like hive mind. Like it is usually they're like very beautiful and they have like no internal conflicts. However, they still perceive themselves as a metaphysical ego with kind of like a
Mm.
separate, separate individual soul that is metaphysically separate. Or like in the case of Brahma, um, an entity who believes is the creator of the universe and like believes is omnipotent and omniscient and so on. Where the Buddhists will say that that's just kind of an illusion that happened because it was the first one to be reborn in one of the upper heavens, and it was lonely for many eons, and then eventually others started to be reborn in that heaven, and so he got the impression that he created those entities. And anyways, just kind of like really wrapped
Yeah.
up in delusions and delusions of power and omnipotence and so on. And essentially one of the key characteristics is that it believes it has a center. Like it believes it's like, oh, like I this is truly me, like that point inside me, like this is who I truly am. It doesn't yet recognize that it's actually a hive mind where all the elements in the hive mind have kind of this religion of being Brahma, right? So like if everybody believes it's Brahma, Brahma as a gestalt emerges. Um,
Mm.
Whereas a Buddha actually would have a radically different self perception. Like the self perception of a Buddha is like there's no center, like there's no part of the hive mind
Yeah.
that is more it than any other part. There's no kind of internal hierarchy, as it were. All of the pieces of a Buddha mind, they know they're impermanent, that there's no self, there's no eternal satisfaction. That is like a knowledge that is holographically embedded in that organism. And it very much feels like, and maybe this is too much information, TMI, but like, yeah, like I mean, some of these like Buddhist beautiful practices and deity yoga and so on, or DMT experiences with Buddha minds, it sometimes actually feels like kind of like what's happening is they're giving you one of their subcells, one of the cells of, I mean, it's a huge hive mind with many, many, many cells, but it can fragment itself, it can divide itself, and it doesn't matter because it's not concerned about like just being one organism. It's kind of like this is slime, actually. Like a Buddha mind is kind of like a slime that is reproducing and spreading around. And so you can actually kind of take one of the cells, one of the tiny pieces of the Buddha, and then embody it inside you. And it's almost kind of like a cultural exchange program. It's like you're having is like, yeah, most of your symbols are fairly dirty and human realm, animal, hungry
Mm-hmm.
ghost, hell realm flavors. But then there's this very crystal clean Buddha cell as well that is teaching the other cells in you that, hey, there's another way. There's another way
Mm.
you can approach yourself or relate to yourself that so much more harmonious. And then maybe it exits you, but it leaves a mark. It is it's kind of like having somebody from I don't know if this is a good metaphor, but having somebody from like Microsoft go to a tiny startup in Mexico where they don't really
Uh-huh.
know what they're doing, where like just injecting this like massive source of knowledge and expertise and acquaintance with daily challenges and how to actually overcome them. It's exactly like that in in my experience.
Very
uh,
interesting. Yeah.
Also meeting people who really advanced meditators has that flavor for me. Like it's almost kind of there's a little bit of this like cell exchange, and then I have kind of like, oh, I'm working with some of their cells to try to better
Yeah.
myself.
Totally. Yeah, there's definitely a contact high that not just with advanced meditators, but I think anybody who's like really inspired by what they're doing, like if you're around other create I'm moving to Austin soon, and one of the main reasons is it's like I like being around that energy. I like there's a lot of creative energy, a lot of, even if I might not agree with everybody in that coffee shop, I can sense there's more creative energy. There's more like quintessence floating around or something, and I like being around that. But anyway, um, yeah, I think you just in some ways elucidated one of the things that I've struggled with the most in trying to understand the sort of like metaphysics of Buddhism compared to Hinduism, which is this if you start studying Buddhism, one of the core pillars of that metaphysics is anatta, right? Anatman, meaning like no atman, no soul. There's not like a
Yeah.
center essence. And then I remember I took Buddhist philosophy classes in college, and I remember asking, you know, okay, if there is no Atman, what is reincarnating? Like, because reincarnation is also part of Buddhism. And it was
Yeah.
always this like difficult to understand conversation. But the way that you were describing that you can be this temporarily, essentially, the way I'm going to try to nutshell what you just said, you can be a temporarily coherent system of consciousness that perceives itself as this solid gestalt thing, but you eventually understand that there is no version of that lasts forever, and that will
Yes.
continuously change and morph and whatever, and there is no essence. And then I guess the counter argument would be, no, there is an essence, and you need to get underneath all of that identity and get underneath all of those illusions, and then you find the essence. And it also reminds me of a conversation we had last time about how that peak experience that like is quintessentially like a 5-meo experience, which I haven't had, but it's like you could, from what I understand, you could interpret that experience as an experience of everything or as an experience of nothing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of this thing that like where the snake eats its own tail, where you feel either hyper connected or hyper alone, and it's really the same thing.
Yeah. Um yeah. I mean the duality of like everything and nothing, it's super profound, and I think very, very real. If people are interested in exploring that more deeply in the QRI world, is something we call zero ontology.
Hmm.
Originally you really expanded upon by David Pierce,
Yeah.
which is like a conception of how, in some sense, like the superposition of all possibilities is kind of equivalent to nothingness, and you see this in consciousness very clearly. I mean, like especially, yes, as you climb up the 5-meo dosage, like there's like some levels of the 5-meo state that it feels like you have all of your experience kind of like passed through a diffraction grading where you see it turn into kind of a rainbow spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, okay, like every sensation is kind of like spread out and it looks like a rainbow spectrum. And then if you take a little bit higher dose, it feels like that rainbow gets reprojected from a certain angle in such a way that all
Mm.
the colors overlap, and then bam, like it disappears or it becomes colorless or transparent.
Wow.
So there is this general pattern that yes, if you can put together all the qualia values or varieties together and balance them out, they all kind of cancel out in this perfect kind of like rainbow circle, and just everything disappears. Meaning that there is some kind of equivalence of like everything at once and just nothingness. There's kind of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And also they're high valence. Like all of these like states of everything all at once, balanced, they tend to feel very blissful, very uh, good, heavenly. Like that seems to us like a really important key. Whereas an improper cancellation, like we're like, oh, it kind of fitted, but not completely, and it didn't fully vanish, that can actually be quite unpleasant. So like, you really want to get it right, exactly right, ideally. Um, and yeah, there are kind of like levels to this unity quality. There is something I would like to address, which is if you go on the oneness train very deeply, and I think like meditatively, ethically, philosophically, perceiving everything as one is very beneficial in some stages of development. But there's like deeper stages where like you kind of have to drop that as like the one fundamental truth and embrace a more expansive kind of set of truths involving like also, hey, oneness and multiplicity together at the same time. Because if you just focus on oneness as the ultimate truth, indeed there's actually some side effects, and they're not often talked about, but they're plainly evident, and you can find lots and lots of trip reports, for example, of people having bad trips with this scenario, which
Yeah.
is if you believe there's only one, as it were, an eternal one. Let's say on LSD, sometimes you enter that state and it feels like kind of this cosmic loneliness. It's like, oh gosh, there's only one, there's nobody else. All it was like an illusion, like a story I made for myself to distract myself from the cosmic loneliness that we are. I think that's actually an illusory aspect of the experience. That actually, like, loneliness is a negative valence feeling. It's a feeling of absence, and um, it is physically unpleasant to feel lonely. And if you look at a lot of kind of bad trip anecdotes of people having that experience, it often is because they were feeling bad as well for other reasons, like they were cold, for example, they're hungry, tired, or they had they were in the come down of an MDMA trip, for example,
Yeah.
where like you
Yeah.
flip from like, oh, we're all together to like, oh, we're all alone. It's like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
opposite on that spectrum. Well, if you're in the MDMA crash, but then you enhance it with LSD, that you may project that feeling of loneliness to the entire cosmos. It's just not just, oh, I'm lonely in the standard sense. It's like a much worse kind of loneliness. Um, but like, no, if you go deeper, especially on like deconstructive emptiness practices, you really realize like, oh my gosh, the feeling of loneliness was a fabrication. Like it was not. It's clearly not ultimate truth. It is kind of this like added reinterpretation of facts that uses kind of like human chimpanzee feelings of the chimpanzee troop, but you're kind of projecting that on God as if God was a chimpanzee, um, rather than chimpanzees being an expression of God, as it were. But yeah, whereas like, I think like the deeper reality, like deep levels of emptiness, is they're completely self-sufficient. There's no feeling of loneliness whatsoever. Like that's left
Mm.
behind completely. Yeah, I just wanted to reassure listeners about that.
Yeah, I can't say I understand that, and I and
Okay,
I,
okay.
and I do have to say that I think consider myself ultimately probably some kind of monist. But
Mhm,
well, let's
mhm.
not. But let's not go. Let's not get stuck there because we're getting deep into the conversation. We haven't talked that much about like the cool shit that QRI does. Like we did talk about that retreat that you did
Yeah,
in our lost conversation, and maybe that would be a good end place to end on because
yeah.
it's sort of in some ways encompasses a lot of what we're talking about because you got together advanced meditators and scientists and philosophers and you had them go into these states of consciousness and talk about the phenomenology, talk about the experience, the mathematics, all of the different aspects of it, and it yielded some really really interesting things in various channels, like some even some like borderline sci things which maybe we can touch on. um yeah, please tell people about this because it's such a
Yeah.
cool thing, and I just
Oh
wish,
yes.
I can't wait to see more of that from you guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. I mean, that's uh, I'll take this opportunity to mention that yes, like we don't quite yet have a date, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be around like November 20 or so. But like we're organizing like a an event in San Francisco. Also, is going to be a bit of a fundraiser, precisely for like the next step of QRI's investigation with psychedelic compounds and exotic states of consciousness. So let me introduce kind of like what we're doing here. Um, so I just have like seen a lot of like psychedelic research. It's beautiful that like in academia, like finally there's the psychedelic renaissance. People are taking it seriously. Advanced neuroscientists, they take LSD seriously, but they don't tend to talk about the phenomenology of themselves, right? Like, in fact, if you go to a conference on psychedelics, there's kind of like two tracks in a sense. There is like, well, what is in the posters and the presentations, the official truth, and then there's the one-to-one conversations that happens at the after party, or like
Yeah, right.
when people are smoking weed outside the hotel or whatever. And like,
Yeah,
usually that's where the juicy,
totally.
really
Yeah,
interesting stuff is. Like, don't get me wrong, I love seeing posters about the connectome of the brain and what does that look like on psilocybin and so on. But you're getting so much closer to the actual fascinating aspects of the phenomenon by like actually going deeper into the phenomenology.
yeah,
Something that kind of I find silly is the standard paradigm for how to study psychedelics in academia is you take people off the streets, essentially, who have very little experience with psychedelics, like usually might even be part of the inclusion criteria, like less than 5 times lifetime experience with psychedelics as like for you to even be let into the study. um, and then you may have 1 or 2 sessions where they scan your brain, and then they give you a questionnaire, typically something like the mystical experiences questionnaire.
yeah.
And then what they can do is say like, hey, this aspect of the questionnaire, let's say oceanic dissolution, correlates with lower activity in the default mode network, etc., etc. This is valuable, and of course, like the data collection, you really need like a high quality lab, and I don't trust randos with the neuroscience data. Like, you really need professionalism
Yeah.
there. But the idea that you're like really capturing anything essential about the experience with these questionnaires, to me, is like completely ridiculous. Like, it's like super childish to believe like that's the approach. I would put it this way, that like if you were trying to study electromagnetism, like as we were talking about, like you know Maxwell's equations, like
Yeah.
if you had this approach of, let's say, like taking people off the streets, giving them like magnets to play with for 5 minutes,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
asking them to fill out a questionnaire, is like, hey, were the magnets like strongly repelling or weakly repelling? It's like the kind of questions you get in the questionnaire. Is like, do you get like complex or simple
Hmm.
geometry? Is like that. That's just so little information. You will never get to Maxwell's equations that way, right? Like, what you really need is create this container where you bring like Faraday and Maxwell and Davy and all these like scientists to spend time, quality time in the lab, drawing these field lines, doing experiments, getting acquainted with it. And after they spend hundreds of hours playing with the phenomenon and documenting it, then actually the hypothesis you suggest probably have a chance of like hitting the phenomenon, right?
Hmm.
So with the same view, this was a dream since like 2015 or so, of like, hey, let's recruit like very talented mathematicians, physicists, and bring them to an island and take psychedelics together, and see if we figure something out. um, and in the end, I decided the three kind of demographics I wanted to sample from the most was advanced meditators, um, advanced like mathematicians, physicists, or broadly scientists, and visual artists, specifically technical visual artists who specialize in depicting psychedelic experiences,
Hmm.
or making art with a code, like using shaders, and um, so that you essentially, if we have an experience, when we come down, we can actually, as a team, iterate over, and within half an hour write up some code that shows some visualizations, and maybe we all agree is like, yes, that's what 5-MeO low dose looked like, or felt like. And so of course there's like biases. Of course there's epistemological nuances here. Somebody may argue like, well, there's going to be a lot of groupthink, like you're just going to convince each other that you understand the phenomenon. um, you really need kind of this like objective third person assessment perspective. But I disagree, actually. Like, I really think it is in those environments where you have essentially people who are like slightly neurodivergent and like really focused on the truth, right? Like they really care, they really want to understand this phenomenon, where you actually have like some chance of like of
Mm.
actually making sense of it. I also, briefly mentioned the retreats. Obviously very experimental. We took a lot of safety precautions, from like having like a nurse, right, witnessing, for example, with the 5-MeO, there was always like somebody around we could ask for help. But then also kind of like how we paced ourselves. So it was a 3-week, both of these were like 3-week retreats, like substantial commitment. We largely subsidized the experience for most of the people, and we fundraised for that. I thought it was like important, especially because some of these people are like nomads, or they don't have a lot of money. That's not where their optimization is focused.
Yeah.
So um and
Like meditating like 8 hours a day. They're not. Yeah, they can't go on a fancy retreat. Yeah.
no. Yeah, exactly. And so, and also really handpicked individuals, and like part of it, I felt like, yeah, let's give them the best optimal experience possible, especially for the first try of doing anything like this. And so we had like 3 types of days. We had um experiment days, where like you had access to mushrooms or ayahuasca or 5-MeO DMT. um then there were work days. Like, very much the mindset is like a startup. It's like, hey, like on work days from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., you're expected to be available to others and offer
Mm.
your skills and services, and maybe work on your projects, but then also like walk around and talk to others and see how you can help them. Wear lots of different hats. Not only get completely caught up in your own research thread. Is like, no, we're a team. We're kind of like a startup. And then, yeah, the third type of day was like rest days, kind of the equivalent of a weekend. So we would kind of like have those sequence of
Cool.
3 days alternating. um and we started with a bunch of specific hypotheses, um things we wanted to test, literally hundreds of like little computer experiments, with visual tasks, little games as well, ways of like recording, like for example, like our eye movements, as we were like looking at different visuals. But really, the gold here was from a methodology we ended up calling kind of the museum of consciousness approach.
Mm.
So
Cool.
because in academia, really, typically, let's say you may be given LSD, and then you have to do all these tasks in a computer monitor. Oftentimes you do the same task like hundreds of times because they're trying to get a high enough like sample size. But typically these tasks are like poorly chosen. I mean, they're usually, because the researchers themselves haven't seen it on psychedelics very often. It's like they don't know the task is actually going to be boring on psychedelics and uninteresting. So you're on mushrooms and you're sitting through these like 3 hours of boring tasks, and in the end there's like no interesting result because it was a poorly chosen task to do. Instead, what we did was, okay, like we had like an ayahuasca ceremony in one location outside of the house with a fireplace and all of the all of the ayahuasca ceremony elements,
Tropes.
making
Yeah.
it cozy and tropey, and yeah, all of that grounding. No, it's very beneficial to have that. But then the house was conditioned in such a way that we had like laptops everywhere, all of them running simultaneously the different experiments that we had pre-decided we were going to explore that night. We also had like video recording and audio recording, lots of places in the house. So essentially, once you were kind of like high enough for things to be interesting, you could enter the house and just approach it like a museum. It's like you play with the things that you find interesting and engaging and are actually interacting with your state. And so in practice, most of the experiments were just not interesting or boring. It's like, oh gosh, I thought this would look interesting on mushrooms, but it just actually doesn't. And like, and then there's some things that look extraordinarily interesting on mushrooms, but you really need to kind of iterate a bunch and write code a bunch of different times and explore in different ways. And we actually did find like some really gem images and animations where, for example, we found this pattern algorithmically generated where if you're sober, it looks like it's a picture, like it's just like completely static, but it's actually moving, but it's just moving in a very subtle and complex way. But if you're on mushrooms, on a low dose mushrooms, and you see that image, you actually see it move. And it's not a hallucination. You actually are
Yeah.
seeing the movement better than people who are sober. And so
Very interesting.
we actually found these cases where being on a psychedelic literally allows you to perceive things more accurately. That is not the case usually. I mean, like usually psychedelics impair your perception in various ways, but there's some things for which they actually enhance them. And that's one of the key things we wanted to document and prove is like, hey, actually, there's like some performance enhancing qualities of these exotic states of consciousness, showcasing the computational value that they have.
So fascinating, man. And I was thinking of saying this at the beginning of this conversation, but I'm going to say it now because it's even more demonstrably true. Is I'm just like, you're such an original thinker, man.
Oh,
You
thank
know,
you.
it's like like you have bits and pieces of and inspirations from places, but it really seems like you're trying to assemble not just like a new way of looking at things, but a way of looking at things that encompasses aspects of reality and ways of gathering knowledge that other people either don't take seriously or they just don't they wouldn't dare go in that kind of a direction because it like flies in the face of what's acceptable in academia and stuff like that. And yeah, man, it's just so you're so much fun to talk to for that reason. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing for that reason. And yeah, man, this has just been super fun. And there's a bunch of stuff again I didn't even get to ask you, and we didn't get to talk about um some of the wild things that you tried at that retreat. But we'll come back to that for the next one for sure, man.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
this has been awesome. I'm
Oh,
really glad we did this
likewise.
again.
I'll can I end with one
Of course,
brief
yes.
announcement. So
Mm-hmm.
uh this is about something we haven't talked at all, but is one of the things we do at QRI, which is we um we take intense suffering very seriously and try to find like pragmatic, useful, beneficial interventions that like may reduce intense suffering, intense pain. And one of the things I actually have a TED talk about this, TEDx Miami, where I presented the case for DMT to be used for cluster headache, aborting cluster headaches. And, cluster headaches is 10 out of 10 pain, one of the most painful conditions known to men. And 1 in 1,000 people suffer from them. They're also called like suicide headaches. I mean, they're just so bad. But DMT, low dose DMT, at the onset of a cluster headache seems capable of like aborting it. I mean, just like within 30 seconds, the pain goes from 10 out of 10, worse than childbirth, to 1 out of 10 or like 0 out of 10. And I haven't personally witnessed these actually happen in real time, but I have friends who have actually seen this, and it probably doesn't work for all patients, but like we're talking about maybe like 90% plus if they use the technique right. And DMT is extremely physically safe. Like nobody has died from pure DMT. Is ridiculously like physiologically tolerable. And also you don't need a hallucinogenic dose for the most part. You just need enough to kind of like feel a little bit melty and enhance colors. So we're launching this initiative very soon called Cluster Free, where we're trying to really build momentum, and it's going to be like a worldwide open letter. And then also we're going to be seeking funding for ideally clinical trials on these and really push the pedal forward. But I just want to mention that, yes, like if you're interested in supporting this effort, feel free to donate to QRI. You can earmark it by saying like, I want my donation to be for cluster headache relief, or you could also earmark and say, I want my donation to be for the DMT retreat, right? Like, or cool. you can earmark the donations, of course, in any way you want. But I just want to say that, yeah, like in my mind, like probably my biggest contribution to the world might actually ultimately not be in kind of the nerdy math of consciousness, but really just like accelerating the reduction of these cluster headaches. So yeah, check it out. It's going to be like clusterfree.org when we release it very soon. And like, please spread it everywhere. And definitely, if you have migraines or cluster headaches, I strongly encourage you to look into that option. DMT might really, really change your life.
Love that. Well, yeah, it will do that. It will do that regardless.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and there's room for both. You can do that, and you can move forward the geometry of
Yes.
consciousness. Yeah, my friend. Fantastic conversation. Thanks for doing it again, and I'm sure we can have many more.
Absolutely. All right. Take it easy, my friend. Thank you so very much.